I couldn't convince young people to even listen to me. They said, where is the cost function? Where is backpropagation of error? Leave me alone. There's one thing about the brain that hasn't been incorporated in the present systems, which is the brain is, of course, guided by internal drives, fundamental goals like nourish yourself and avoid danger and procreate and social instincts and so on. The investment is here. The expectation, the expectation that it is worthwhile to invest is here. The motivation is here. The vision of economical application is here. But the present technology will hit a wall. So I'm convinced we have 2 more years or so, and then the brick wall will be all too visible.
Hello and welcome everyone to Audio Tokens, the 14th episode. And this is the podcast where we try to generate audio tokens for training our future AGI overlords. Today I have the pleasure to have Christoph van der Malsburg with me. And he's been in AI for a very long time. He's been the president of the European Neural Network Society in the 90s. But his main focus has been on understanding the brain. He's been a board member of the Human Brain Project. And he has always been very interested in how can we get insights for training neural networks or AI systems in general, but inspired by the brain. And I'm very excited to have him today because he was actually a guest lecturer on one course I took at ETH during my master's. And this was the single most interesting lecture I've had during my 5 years at universities. So I'm super excited. Also, another thing is that I'm a lot in the circles in Silicon Valley where everyone believes in scaling is just a solution to everything in AI. And this is not his point of view. So this is going to be a super, super interesting conversation. Welcome to the podcast.
I'm glad to be interviewed by you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, so like I said, you've been in AI for a very, very long time. And I think a lot of people that are just diving into it because of the latest hype and all of this have heard things like the AI winters and the field has evolved since the 60s, but just now we got the scaling working, all of this. Can you maybe give, you've been in this field for a long time, can you maybe give a brief overview of the history of the field and what stages it has gone through, who has been involved, and what were the breakthroughs and stuff like this?
The whole venture is, of course, the attempt to replicate the mind in a computer. So one has to start with computers in formulations like those by Church and Post and Turing, the Turing machine. And there are 2 branches to the field. One is based very strictly on the computer, on the algorithmic idea, and the other is based on neurons. And a very important starting point for the 2 branches is this paper by McCulloch and Pitts about logical networks, which they proved, a rather trivial proof, could realize any arbitrary logical input-output functions. And these networks are gates, are actually digital systems they described. And they also interpreted their neurons, their gates as neurons. And one of the branches of the field is based on the manipulation of symbols and on formal mathematics. And the history of the field is really a seesaw between the 2 branches, one winning and the other being dunked in a winter. I think by now the symbolic branch has fallen by the wayside, so I will stay with the neural branch. Now, one of the heroes of the neural branch is Donald Hebb, who described in 1949 a way of realizing mind things in neural networks. And he was not the first, but he is now cited most, the idea of the associative mechanism, of the idea of synaptic plasticity. 2 neurons are wired together if they have fired in a correlated fashion. Another book with the same content actually is by Friedrich von Hayek in 1952, but everybody cites Donald Hebb. And then, so this book by Donald Hebb really focused on the idea of representation of things in the mind. And the idea was that single neurons are elementary symbols that stand for something, like a red color in a particular point, or your grandmother, or what have you, atomic symbols. And the state of the brain is justly described, according to this idea, by specifying which of the neurons are active. And so the main idea was that sets of neurons that have been active together in the past wire together and can be revived that way. And the idea is the idea of the assembly. And there is a whole range of people who picked that idea up. There is an Englishman by name of Taylor, a German Steinbuch, David Wilshaw, a friend of mine, Günther Palm, Amari, Hopfield, of course, who got the Nobel Prize for his formulation of the thing, the associative memory. This was one of the two main ideas dominating the field of neural-based intelligence ideas. And I'm sorry to say this is a catchy idea, but it never found any application. It is nonsensical in the sense that the task of the brain is not storing a particular state, because the world is too complex, the situations are too variable. So what you need instead of that is a toolbox, a construction kit, which can construct variably compositions for variable situations. So that much for that branch of neural network theory. And the other branch was started maybe by people like Oliver Selfridge, who formulated something he called the pandemonium. So in order to recognize an object, he imagined you have a set of feature cells which cry out, it's this, it's that, it's that, and by some kind of collective judgment, the thing comes to the conclusion, it's a zebra, for instance, the pandemonium. And that was turned into something very real by Frank Rosenblatt in around 1960, which created a great stir, a great hype at the time. The perceptron. And the perceptron, the other idea that dominated the field, is still dominating today. That's the basic framework for what we have today, for AI today. Then this field fell into into a neural winter. For some reason, the perceptron got stuck. But I think that is really the history of the field, and we are still enmeshed in this framework very solidly. And I think we'll talk more about how to get out of this framework.
Right. So the perceptron, that's the building block for these bigger deep learning models that we have today, right? And it's inspired by neurons in the brain, or
it's inspired by neurons in the brain, and it's inspired by this idea of a hierarchy of feature detectors, culminating in highest level concept detectors, individual neurons that stand for high level concepts. That's the basic idea, and the whole thing based on learning. In distinction to Hebbian learning, this is based, as you know, as everybody knows, on the backpropagation of error. So the idea is that you need a teacher, a human teacher, who gives the correct answers to the questions posed in form of the input, and the system does nothing but adapt to its weights in order to be able to answer correctly, in the sense of repeating what humans have said.
Right. So if you got the right ideas, so to speak. You got the perceptron a long time ago. Why? And it's still the building blocks for what we do today. Why did it take so long to to get to the current point?
I think it was mainly lack of data and lack of processing power. I had somebody who took me as a mentor for a long time, and he traveled with me from university to university, and liked my ideas. And then he left the ship and said two things. One was, "Oh, to my shock, all I discover in there is just a perceptron." That was one statement he made. And the other one was, but it works, and so leave me alone with your ideas. So it took so long because the whole field was sort of fettered by lack of processing power. And of course, in the present mindset, lack of data.
Right. So famously, there's been like two AI winters. Are they for the same reason, or what were the reasons for the two of them?
Several reasons. I think one was, lack of processing power. The hypes, the various waves of hypes were induced by very simple examples and extrapolation from that. Frank Rosenblatt, there were publications in newspapers at the time. Navy Monster. He was financed by ONR, Office of Naval Research. Navy Monster does this or that. So it was all an extrapolation, and then, given time, it became clear that the extrapolation didn't hold water. And another effect, I think, is a generational effect. When I entered the field, I had been a physicist, and I entered the field in 1970, there was still a great enthusiasm of being able to understand the brain from the neurophysiological point of view. And then within years, all the leading figures fell back into deep depression, and they gave up on the task. And I think one just had to wait for a new generation of young people who that it cannot be so difficult. You have a working brain. You have a working brain. Let's do it in the computer.
Yeah. Yeah, so obviously we have had a lot of, like you said, perceptron came from inspired by neurons in the brain. There's been several of these like ideas that came from neuroscience, right? That part of our current like big LLMs, inspired by that. What are some other apart from the perceptron like ideas that power our current AI systems that came from the brain?
Well, I was shocked, deeply shocked by this. By this little text by Rich Sutton, who wrote a bitter lesson, or the bitter lesson. I think it was bitter for him too, saying that forget about all those insights gleaned from neurophysiology and cognitive science and so on. That they weren't helpful. They were rather in the way. All we needed is data, data, data. So the field now is living with the idea there wasn't really much to be learned from the brain. And I think that is unfair. As you just said, the perceptron was inspired by the brain. And then, of course, it was very important, the realization there's nothing in the brain but neurons and their connections. And so that must be the framework in which you will find the solution. I mean, this is very encouraging. Of course, there have been and still are very wild other ideas. So the search space was very reduced by these ideas. And then I think we will come to that. There are still things realized in the brain that our present technology doesn't incorporate at all. And so there is still much to be learned, whether we'll learn it through neuroscience as a field, or whether we will learn it the hard way by thinking about the thing or experimenting on the computer is another question. Let me make a remark about the role of neuroscience in the broad sense, including cognitive science and psychology and so on. I think that field had been, when seen under the perspective of how does the brain work, has been stagnating for decades, and has been and is in a kind of Tower of Babel situation. There are these different subfields that one by one cannot cover the whole problem, and they cannot talk to each other. They speak different language, and so that they don't complete the problem. I think that is a very sad state of affairs. Integration of these various ideas that are swimming around is necessary, and I am convinced that the essential ideas are around, but they need to be integrated with each other.
And you think they are like around in these like psychology, neuroscience, like these fields, and not just in scaling up the LLM and the data?
Yeah, I'm critical of the idea of, doubtful that scaling, I'm convinced scaling is not going to solve the problem.
Right. Yeah, we'll get into that. But like moving forward, so like you said, like Richard Sutton made this like the bitter lesson post. I've heard like Demis Hassabis, who was famously into neuroscience when he was younger. I think he said something along the lines that like now we're seeing diminishing returns on learning from the brain. And like the classic argument, like we don't build airplanes like birds, right? Like you don't have to build things exactly how nature does it. Like there are sometimes like more efficient way of doing it. Do you think like are these yeah, do you, obviously maybe you don't, but like what's the argument for the idea of learning from the brain going forward?
Well, there's one thing about the brain that hasn't been incorporated in the present systems, which is the brain, the animal and human brain, is of course guided by internal drives, fundamental goals like nourish yourself and avoid danger and procreate and social instincts and so on, which are not incorporated in the present technology at all. I just read about the processes that very strenuous and expensive processes that go into the LLMs today, which you could only describe as education. You know, there are hundreds and thousands of people who test these systems on a regular basis and train them by reinforcement learning, human-guided reinforcement learning, to avoid bad behavior, like don't give an answer to how do I steal a car, or how can I kill many people with little input, and so on. This is education, which is put on those systems from the outside. And this is a very inefficient process. We will come to the efficiency issue learning. So I think what we still have to learn from the brain is what ethologists like Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen and so on 100 years ago described as the control of behavior of animals in terms of schematically described basic goals like who is your mother? How do you recognize your mother? The goslet that hatches out of the egg is given by nature a description of what mother is looking like. It is a mobile, a moving object in your neighborhood that issues a certain kind of sound, ga ga ga. And that is the description, very abstract, and usually it is Mother Goose that is nearby, and so the goslet takes in the actual smell and sight of the Mother Goose, but Konrad Lorenz wiggled a Wellington boot in front of the goslet and imitated the sound, and so from then on the goslet followed the Wellington boot. So this gives an idea of uh, how those innate drives are formulated, and it poses the problem of, number one, how are they formulated? How can they be put in the computer? And number two, a much more difficult problem: how can these very abstract schemata be applied to real situations, of which our brain is just great? One of the behavioral patterns that are innate is, of course, how to deal with competition. Competition could be somebody else wanting to eat the same food you have in front of you, and so you have to push the person away. But we apply that in science. Yeah, there's competition. There's this great goal of understanding the brain, and here's this competitor who claims and so on. So these different applications of the same underlying schema are very different in detail. And the brain, that is to be learned from the brain. How can these abstract things be identified in concrete situations?
Right. So the takeaway from the goose story basically is that there's something innate before even the goose is born, that it should follow some kind of mother figure, and then he tricked so that the baby goose thought that this thing, was it like a bell or something, was the mother.
A boot,
A boot,
a
yeah,
rubber boot, a Wellington
a rubber
boot.
boot, right? Okay, so that begs the question, like, what does what does it mean to being born, or like what is this like surely, because that innate thing developed maybe while it was in the egg or something, like before it was born, and then there's like some point where it was actually created. But like with neural networks, I guess like we train them, and then when we release them to the world, we don't train them anymore. And you could maybe see the training process as learning the innate things. Where am I going with this? but,
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
but
of
like,
course. I mean, if you give a prompt to an LLM, it picks up your intention, your
yeah,
what is the matter. So if you give the prompt, how can I steal a car? Then the native, untrained, uneducated LLM looks up in its memory and finds ways of stealing a car, or the car is stolen, and so it responds to that. But it is not guided by a fixed set of ethical rules or goals. It picks up those intentions from the prompt, and so is OpenAI just retracted its latest version of GPT-4o because it was too sycophantic. It was too pleasing to the user. So it has no backbone, no moral backbone. And I think for intelligence, you need very abstractly formulated fundamental goals, and of course we would like our AI to follow ethical rules, and so that is a grossly missing thing. The hot frontier of AI is, of course, autonomous robots. The Chinese think they can win the race to the moon by building autonomous humanoid robots. And that field will, of course, run big time into the problem that the autonomous car development has run into. The diversity of situations you can run into is infinite. And you cannot treat all the different situations one by one. That's impossible. You need very abstractly formulated rules of conduct, which can then be applied to totally novel scenes.
yes. Although, from my own intuition, it feels that deep learning is uniquely well positioned for for that problem, because like you can't specify like if you can't specify an infinite amount of rules of conduct, but if you just train on experience, then surely that should generalize to some point.
Yeah. We will come to the efficiency of learning. Our kids, by the age of 12 or so, they understand traffic situations very well. We don't give them the keys because the ethical side the responsibility side is not yet developed in them. They need more education, sure, but they understand what's going on. Oh, there was an accident. There is a helmet rolling on the street. So, to whom does it belong? Or what is the intention of this or that participant? Each scene, each these so-called corner or edge cases is its own history, and you have to go back to rather abstract concepts in order to make sense of them. Whereas, the Tesla and the other car companies, they are frantically collecting data on concrete scenes, tens of thousands of them, in order to learn about them. That kind of learning is very inefficient. So you need, I think this is the essence of intelligence, of being able to reduce particular situations to the bare bones of the principle. That is really the essence. And when learning from examples, the danger is too great to learning solutions by rote. This example works this way, this example, this example this way. And in order to be really, to jump from the samples you have seen to totally novel samples, you need to argue on a very abstract level. And
Okay,
that is, yeah.
and how, so help me understand, like how does that look? Because for me it feels like the 3-year-old is learning the traffic situation, or like the 10-year-old, because it has seen a lot of traffic before, and it generalizes situations because it has seen some very similar thing, and then it can like generalize to some point. If you do the, like, how do you learn these abstract concepts of the traffic situation if you don't do it with a lot of data?
I think, there is a very, very good paper on this theme, on this topic of schema-based thinking. And this paper is by David Rommelhart. The schema-based thinking is an old idea. The earliest person usually cited is Immanuel Kant, and then there are people of 100 years ago or so. There's a lot of theorizing about it. What is, what David Rummelhart says in that paper is that he believes that it is very rare that a new schema is brought up, is designed. Children come, or animals come with a rather complete set of schemata that is enough to categorize and understand usual situations. And when you look at a child playing with little horses and little cars and so on, they think in terms of intentions. Oh, the intention of this is that, and this was to destroy that, and this was wants to take away that, and they have an innate kind of arch model of animal behavior or human behavior. Also, the social interaction is innate to a very large extent. So I don't think this, let's say, this grammar of how the world of interacting agent ticks is learned from example. They bring the grammar to the table. And what they have to learn is, of course, that they have the concept of aggression. One of the stimuli of aggression is, of course, bare teeth and growling and so on. So they are there are very basic situations that are the recognition of which is innate, but then in playing and so on, aggression the act of aggression can be expressed in very different terms, and the children have to learn what the signs of this are. That is part of the process of education. But as I said, I think the underlying grammar, if I may call it that way, the syntax of interaction of agents is built in.
And when you said built in, is it so it's not learned from experiences of that agent or that person, but is it like learned from evolution, like millions of years of like it's
Yes,
passed on
exactly,
from
exactly.
your okay, and what in the brain is there like a mechanism in the brain, or like what is the mechanism in the brain to pass on experiences from generations above you?
You know, there are these very small millimeter size structures in the brainstem which encode these things. There's a very, very active field in neuroscience these days where elementary behavior in animals, of course, mostly in mice, is analyzed in terms of which neural nuclei are active and which transmitters and which connections encode these behaviors. Like the maternal care behavior of mice is one such. You know, the virgin mice don't care for distress calls of pups, but as soon as they are mothers themselves, they have very strong reactions to these distress calls of pups that have fallen out of the nest, and that induces in them the rote behavior of picking up the pups and putting them back into the nest, even if it's not their own pups. So there is, as I said, a very active research field. Is very hard work because it's complicated and difficult to study, but the arsenal of experimental techniques is growing very rapidly to find out what these networks are that encode those schemata.
Hmm. And okay, and they evolve, or like they emerge from your parents, basically. Uh,
Exactly, they're inherited, and I'm sure our single-celled ancestors, you know, very simple protists, they already had something like aggression and stress and fear and hunger and those very basic modes of behavior were already expressed in molecular terms at that time, of course, and are now expressed still in molecular terms. They are specific transmitters, of course, like testosterone that induces sexual behavior, for instance, as we know very well. You know, there's still a molecular thing, but also more complex circuits that encode these basic modes of behavior.
right. Okay, so it seems then that it's quite useful to learn more about the brain to understand how this is passed on more. You were part of the Human Brain Project. Can you tell us a little about what that is? I've heard about it, but why were you involved in that, and what is it?
Well, I was very interested because, you know, the original formulation of by Henry Markram, who was the originator of the idea, was let us build a working brain. So the original question was addressing the function of the brain. And then this 1 billion project, half of the money was to come from Brussels, from the European Union. The other half had to be raked up from the participating nations. Then it quickly changed its style and forgot about the brain function. To me, it was a gigantic disappointment, this project. There were two components. Neural robotics was one component, the other was neuromorphic computing, which were addressing the function of the brain question, but they dwindled away in the process of the whole thing. And what was left it was very useful, but not for understanding the function of the brain, but for understanding medicine. I mean, the Human Brain Project left behind was a big apparatus for collecting data about anatomy and physiology and data collection, which is extremely useful for medicine. So I was, it was towards the end of my active career, so I wasn't really involved actively in the Human Brain Project. I was asked to act on an advisory board, which, frankly speaking, was more for window dressing than to collect any advice. So, as I said, I was deeply disappointed by the whole project.
Right. What are some other projects that are like just starting now that you're excited about for the future of learning about the brain?
Well, as I said, this research on fundamental guide of control of behavior is very important. And then, of course, there is this continuing question of how perception work, and how our brain is able to construct the representation of situations. You know, the situation in which I am immersed here, there is an intent of our conversation, of course. There is a room in which I am surrounded, and so on. My brain has a detailed representation, detailed to the extent that it is relevant for my behavior, detailed representation of my environment, which allows me to predict, at least on a very short time scale, predict very precisely what's going to appear in my eyes, for instance, in the next split second. I don't think one can say that the present version of AI is able to build up this kind of scene representation. In its geometrical, its dynamical aspects, and especially, as I said, in its functional aspect, what is going on in the scene, what's the purpose, what's the intent, what are the agents doing. So that has been, that has a very, very long history. It goes back 2,000 years, this question of how our brain represents things. And I think here we have a point where the present AI is really in a cul-de-sac. What do we see in a blind alley? One of the problems to be solved there is our brain is exposed to, is in contact with the world with arrays of sensors and with muscles, muscle fibers. And these are millions of building elements, which one by one mean nothing. So if you look at one pixel at a screen, it doesn't tell you anything about what is going on. You have to look at something like hundreds or thousands of pixels before you can make sense of what you have there. So the first problem in representation is how you make the progress, the transition from individual sensory elements to high-level objects, like the pattern of your face. I mean, your face tells me a lot of things, who you are and what your expression is and what your whether you're listening to me or distracted or what have you. So how can one? How are these high-level patterns represented? And a very fundamental and a truth about the present technology is the high-level representation is based on single neurons. I have had very heated discussions with friends who say that's not true. You are not up to today. There are very novel, generative models, and there is something like autoencoders, but I think I prevailed. All high-level patterns are represented by individual neurons, and in order to do justice to a whole situation, you may need hundreds or maybe millions of neurons, which one by one stand for individual high-level patterns. And that is a very poor representation and is at the source of the tremendous inefficiency of artificial intelligence of learning. Our kids, when they are 3 years old or so, you show a new kind of object, like a remote control for TV. And they inspect it for a few seconds, and then they have it. They recognize all remote controls. They know what you do with it, whether it is a remote control of a TV or a little car or what have you. This kind of generalization totally evades, is not present in AI. And how can they do that? The answer is, of course, very clear. They take in the sight of an object, and they create a model an explicit model of that object, which ties together all the details of that thing. It's an extended thing, which has details, and at the same time is a high-level object, and that's a crucial point to be solved here, and we will have to discuss to talk more about that. So they now have a high-level model of this particular object, and when they see another sample of the same kind, they can map this stored model point by point in matching the structure to a new example. So there is structure which you can match on the basis of, like you take the first model you have taken in as a schema, which you now apply to a new sample. And so after showing a kid a zebra for the first time, maybe a wooden little model, it knows them all. Whereas in our MLPs, in multi-level perceptrons, the schema, which is at the output, a single neuron, which is told, is taught about zebras by the teacher who's switching on this cell whenever in the sample image there is a zebra, and switches off if there is no zebra. That's all the system gets. To train the cells, you need hundreds or millions of samples in order to get all the variations a zebra can take on in images. Whereas if you had, as I said, a representation of the zebra, the four legs and the ears and the snouts and the painting and so on in a rich model, a zebra schema, you can match that onto new samples, and you can learn within seconds and single samples.
Right. So let me just play the roles of your friend then. There is, like in mechanistic interpretability, they try to understand like how the field started with, they try to see if there are like single neurons in AI systems that corresponds to single concepts. But what they found was that there are way more concepts in the world than there are neurons in a neural network. So what they found instead was that you could actually have like linear combinations of neurons map to one concept in the real world. And then you have many, many more possibilities of mapping neurons combination. There's many more like combinations of neurons than individual neurons, right? And I think this is what they've seen. It's not like super clean research, but I think to some extent, they found For example, there's this research by Anthropic with like Golden Gate Claude, which is that they found in their Claude model, they found some combination of neurons that corresponded to the Golden Gate, or like the concept of the Golden Gate. And what they did was that they then artificially boosted those neurons, so they like got higher weights, so they were like more involved more often. This like linear combination of neurons that was like representing the Golden Gate. And then the model started to talk about Golden Gate all the time. You were like, oh, I need to go to the supermarket, and the model would respond like, oh, but you first should go and see the Golden Gate and then go to the go to the supermarket. Isn't this kind of similar to what you just explained?
So in all present day AI models, you have a hierarchy of feature detectors. And on the highest, on any given level of this thing, there are certain combinations of the feature detectors that are prominent in statistical terms, right? That they co-occur. This linear combination thing is one way of finding them. And the response of the present concept of how to represent those dominating clusters of features is by having a next layer where the cluster is represented by a higher level feature detector. Okay? And this is a tragic kind of thing because you have to stop at some level. And so let's assume that the level is high enough so that all kinds of coherent objects are already recognized, and all kinds of individual actions. Somebody is aggressing somebody else, or something is grasping something or taking away something, actor, agent in a scene. All of these are represented by high-level neurons. You still have to distinguish a novel situation with a novel mix of these and make sense of it. And how do you do that? Go to the next level again? So that's a tragic kind of problem. So there must be an alternative way of representing the structure of, let's assume you have up to a certain level of complexity neurons to represent scenes in terms of the concept nodes you already have. And let me take a completely different kind of metaphor. If I have a solid object in my hand here, like my cup, we all know it's composed of molecules. And these molecules hold each other by the hands, by forces. So together they form a solid body. That is what physicists call a collective effect. So what I claim is the right representation of high-level concepts in our brain is you have fairly low-level neurons that stand for fairly low-level concepts, features, and a high-level object is formed by a mass of those which stabilize each other by mutual connections. So let me refer to an observation that was taken very seriously in psychology 100 years ago in the Gestalt movement. You know, those people, they were German Jews, Köhler, Kafka, Wertheim. This is a tragic story because they were driven out of Germany by Hitler. And they were taken by this phenomenon that when you see something like you have a screen with randomly moving dots, and a subset of these dots moves as if painted onto the surface of a rigid object that is turning in front of you. your brain picks out that subset. Immediately you see that object as made up of individual moving dots, which they formulated rules for how this is possible. Here the relevant rule is that dots that move together, they are bound together. What does it mean being bound together? So the neurons responding to those stimuli, they excite each other so that they are tied together like a solid object, like the molecules of my cup. They're tied together and now take on global properties like the global movement, the axis of rotation that you see. This Gestalt movement had the tragic not only that an autocratic system drove them away, but they didn't know how to implement that. To this day, the field is still alive. It's having a revival after revival, the Gestalt psychology. But to this day, they don't know how to implement that phenomenon. And I think I already gave you the answer. The right implementation is that here is a set of individual neurons that are excited by the input. In my moving dot thing, all these individual neurons, dots excite neurons that are movement specific and specific to a position. And a subset of those neurons are not only excited by the input, but also by mutual connections from other nearby neurons, with which they, according to some pre-wiring or according to some learning, they have learned they often occur together. Co-moving neurons, they know they belong together, they have strengthened their connections. And so the idea is, the idea I'm pushing here for representation of complex objects is neurons need not only afferent input excitation, but they also need support from other neurons over connections that have been trained or wired in the past, in order to create something like a collective phenomenon, a set of neurons that stabilize each other. And the connections are, of course, to a large extent, it's a small extent they are pre-wired, but to a large extent they are learned from experience, and the experience is based on the large-scale patterns never recur. Particular image version of your face on my screen is, of course, ephemeral. It changes, then all the pixels move and the face distorts and so on. But there are small sub-patterns that are rather stable and recur not only from moment to moment when looking at one object, but they also recur in other objects. So there are lots of small arrangements of neurons that co-occur again and again and are wired together. And these arrangements, they form the hierarchy of features. One neuron and its supporters, it's a feature of a certain complexity. But if you take the supporters of the supporters also, then you have a larger, so you have a hierarchy of feature detectors which are all based on low-level features, but they are tied together by mutual connections. And the big difference between the ordinary single neuron feature detectors, which stand side by side and don't know how to speak to each other, and those sets of low-level features put together as I call them net fragments, the big difference there is that different net fragments overlap neuron-wise. They amalgamate into large-scale patterns in a natural way. So a totally novel object I'm seeing in front of me can be represented in my brain by putting together lots of little net fragments I have seen in the past, which fit together like the jigsaw puzzles and form a model of this totally novel pattern so that I can deal with it. It's a totally different way of representation, and I think the whole field of neural network will have to revert to that mode of representation.
Right. Yeah. We're touching on the paper that you actually wrote at the same time as you gave that lecture that I was very inspired by. And from that lecture, you had a very good slide where you said like, so the brain to describe the brain's wiring, you need like 1 terabyte of data. But then like the genetic information is only 1 gigabyte or something, and then the training data to get that is only another gigabyte. So then like 2 gigabytes to get 1 terabyte, like where's the other 99.999 coming from? And I think this is like, does this come from the innate thing that we talked about before? Like I'm trying to tie this together now, and that like this innate thing creates the net fragments even before you start to experience things from this 1 gigabyte of training data. Am I understanding it correctly, or how would you describe that?
Yeah. So you pose the problem. How can it be that these some people believe our genome can be compacted to 50 megabyte, and to describe the wiring of the brain, it needs what did you say?
Yeah.
Petabytes, petabytes,
Yeah, yeah.
10 to the
Okay.
15 bytes. Yeah, how is that possible? Now, there is a big discussion in biology about how the organism is described by genes, and which already poses, of course, that question, even if you don't talk about the brain, how is a complex body like yours, how can it be described by a few genes? Genes do not contain blueprints, little drawings of how the nose is shaped and how the ear is shaped and how the wiring. That's not how it is. What the genes do is they encode the making of molecules, of proteins and lipids and various kinds of molecules. That is one task they perform. And these molecules are the substrate, the building blocks of living cells, of course, and of tissues. And then what the genes do in addition to that is, the building blocks have the tendency to form larger scale assemblies or the structures. Like lipid molecules form membranes by themselves, like soap molecules form soap bubbles. The bubble is not encoded in any way. It's a natural way for interacting molecules to create form. So we are living in a world where building elements, molecules, have a tendency to build structured forms that is innate in the world. And these structured forms have the property of self-consistency. All the forces between the participating molecules are in equilibrium. Crystals are a very clear-cut example where the periodic crystal lattice is stabilized by each molecule being held in place by its neighbors, and the neighbors are held in place by their neighbors, and so on. So the world is dominated by structures that have the property of self-consistency. And these structures are given in a totally immaterial and eternal way, if I may say so. Mathematicians can argue about them. They have classified periodic crystals 150 years ago and have found there are 235 types, and nature has to stay with these types. There is no other possibility. So all that matter can do is pick one of these. And so what the genes do, in addition to encoding for the building elements, is they pick from among the possible arrangements a subset. What kind of the early forms of the embryo is a bubble, and then the bubble makes this involution and so on. So the genes are responsible at branching points in a growing embryo of picking this or that kind of form that is in the nature of the material building elements. And so biology is struggling with this conceptual framework, and the view I'm giving has not won yet. When one speaks of emergence, the right forms emerge as a result of the interacting forces. And so this kind of explanation I offer as the mechanism for developing the embryo till the moment of birth. Okay? So it is very important here that the initial wiring diagram that is created this way makes it possible for the individual neurons to find their partners in those recurring patterns that sensory patterns, to find their partners. In vision, the partners are nearby in 2D space, of course. And so it's very important that the wiring of the connection from the eye to the brain respects topology, so that things that are nearby in the eye are nearby in the brain, so that a neuron can be sensitive with its in its neighborhood, with its connection in the neighborhood, can fish out those other neurons that have a high likelihood of being co-activated. So it is very important that the pre-wiring of the brain that you are born with makes it possible for the individual neurons to find their partners, their supporters. That is a necessary condition for learning. And then from then on, the actual wiring is guided by this learning mechanism in which neurons rake up, collect connections from other neurons with which they have a high likelihood to be activated. And the goal of this process is to create large-scale organized collective representations, which are networks of individual neurons, each of which found supporters in its neighborhood. So these are self-consistent networks. It's like a jigsaw puzzle has this property of self-consistency. Given a piece, it admits only one particular other piece at each of its sides, which again permits only one. So it sounds like a miracle that from this heap of pieces, this goes on and on and on. You never end up in a situation where there is no fitting piece. Now, of course, it's not a miracle because the whole thing was started with a complete picture which would separate it into the pieces. But in our brain, the pieces admit several neighbors on each side, which makes it much richer. And it still has to conform to the condition that of being able to create large-scale networks which are self-consistent, where all the participants find their friends in place. And the development, the algorithm, the Kolmogorov algorithm, we have to talk about Kolmogorov complexity. The Kolmogorov algorithm of the brain is the mechanism that favors that the plasticity mechanism in individual neurons that drives networks to be self-consistent.
Right. So maybe before we go there, background on what Kolmogorov complexity and algorithms are, but just to make me understand what you just said. So basically, like in nature has some kind of rules for how things emerge from its initial state, basically, and this initial state can be very simple and not very complex. But then nature imposes some rules on how this emerges, so that the thing that emerges is way more complex than the initial state. Something like
Yeah.
that.
So you're right, exactly. So you have started as as a clump of individual neurons that stuck together, not neurons, living cells, of course, and this clump of cells has several possibilities of getting differentiated. And so one of the possibilities is that this clump of cells shapes itself as a globe, as a set of cells that form the surface of a sphere. And there would have been other possibilities, but the genes make sure that from all the possibilities, this one was taken. And then the next thing was that there are various possibilities to go from a sphere to something more complex. And the genes just from stage to stage, more degrees of freedoms are opened. And the genes make sure that from all the possibilities of the degrees of freedom, a particular subset or a particular version is selected.
Okay, so how do you what is Kolmogorov complexity, and how do you explain this from that point of view?
Kolmogorov mused about how do we describe the complexity of any structure you encounter. And his statement is the complexity of that structure is the shortest, is the number of bits in the shortest algorithm that is able to create that structure. So a marvel of low Kolmogorov complexity is, of course, those Julia sets or Mandelbrot sets, infinitely, in literal sense, infinitely complex structures, which, however, can be created from a few hundred bits of an algorithm, computing for different points whether they are part of the set or not. So the statement you marveled about, how can a petabyte of connectivity be described by a few megabyte or gigabyte of genetic information is, it just says the Kolmogorov complexity of the brain is very low. And the explanation in this particular case that I gave is that there is a rule encoded in the genes which decides in the space of all possible connectivities, which connectivities are admitted or not. And the rule is build self-consistent networks. So strengthen connections which between pairs of cells which are co-activated not just because they have a direct connection, but because there are indirect connections which stabilize that connection. So walk towards arrangements of connections which have this ability of self-stabilization, self-strengthening.
Right, and this is where you said like a child can pick up the fact that like a toy zebra and a real zebra is kind of the same thing, because the consistency, those type of networks fire closely together.
Yeah, right. And it's in that particular case, one has to think in terms of a network which consists of the model the child has acquired previously of the zebra, the current picture of the zebra, which is another network. And the identification of the two is a network which links these two point by point. You know, the tip of the nose of the zebra to the tip of the nose of the image, the tip of the ear, and so on, point by point, in a mapping which connects like elements, like features, and such that neighbors connect to neighbors. So that's what one calls a homeomorphic mapping. Homeomorphic means the same shape. It pays attention to the feature type, the types that are connected, and the neighborhood relations that are, or the connectivity relations. And so the idea here is that that kind of network, which applies a schema to an instant, is an attractor in connectivity space. That is a natural thing that which is not really built in detail, but it is in the nature of things. Self-consistency is in the nature of things.
Yeah. So I went back, looked at some of your papers from 40 years ago, and I saw many of the same ideas that we talk about here. So why do you think these ideas haven't caught on in like the mainstream AI circles?
Yeah. This is you know, my career is very specific. I have had 40 PhD students, and 9 of them or so have become professors themselves. And they understood very well what I was talking about. They realized bits of that, they were instrumental in our common progress here. They were very creative. But when they left me to become professors themselves, they reverted to the ruling paradigm. And so to one of them, I said, "Are you crazy? You have built a big gun here. Why don't you shoot with it?" And he said, yeah, I can do that later, but now I have to build my career. You have to howl with the wolves in order to have a career. It's the paradigm phenomenon. You know, of course, of Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He says science is dominated by conceptual frameworks that are self-consistent, where all the parts fits together, and which, for a while, are very productive. They allow to assemble lots of detail and fit them into the structure. But then it happens that the usefulness of this framework has run out of steam, and it gets more and more difficult to adjust to the reality, to accommodate new observations, and then everybody starts to look right and left, and then happens a revolution, and a new framework is put up. And of course, the basic model of that is the explanation of the movement of the celestial bodies. The old idea was the Earth is in the center of everything and everything turns around it, but then it became more and more complicated to understand how Venus could go in loops across the sky. How can it do that? And then Copernicus came along and said, "Hey, listen, we are rotating around the sun," and then it all makes sense. And it took 100 years for astronomy to revert, to go through this paradigm shift, he calls it. And I think you asked the question, how am I alone? Pretty alone, I must say. There are a few people who are congenial with me, but they are not very outspoken about it. They anyway, I feel pretty alone, which has great advantages. Nobody treads on my feet. If I don't solve a particular question now, let me wait a few more years and I solve it myself. And no anxieties that somebody else eats away that tidbit. So the field is self-consistent in a sense. The fact that the representation of high-level objects is done with individual neurons in present-day AI is it cannot be otherwise with backpropagation of error. They
What do
stabilize
you
each
mean?
other. The way the human teacher tells the system it is a a zebra is by way of a single neuron that says a zebra or not. The alternative would have to be that the teacher comes forward with a concrete extended representation of the zebra and teaches that way, which we don't do. We do it with individual neurons. And so all of this fits together. There is this global cost function, the reduction of the error, which guides the whole thing. You don't have to think about the dynamics of the system. It's remarkable that in those important papers like the one that introduced the transformer, the learning mechanism wasn't even mentioned. You don't find it in there. Everybody knew, well, this is taken care of in the software. I mean, you have this formulation of the backpropagation of error, this thing that it takes you through the different layers that is coded into the system. Don't think about it and don't touch upon it because it has been massaged into the GPU network. I mean, you are in a rut. You can't get out. And so, I tried. You asked me how come I'm still alone. When I talk to others, they don't. They are not really up to taking all my arguments, and they say, well, beat the benchmarks, show me that it works, and then I will trust you. Then I will take you seriously. Well, so I tried to do that. I planned a startup company. You find the remnants of that in the form on the network under the address platonite.com. I don't know whether you have found that, platonite.com. Plato was, of course, my godfather here. And my intention was to build a startup company that replicated what our kids do when seeing an object for the first time. They build a model and recognize them all. That was the plan. And I'm pretty sure I would have gotten the money. I talked to a venture capitalist who understood to a surprising amount what I was talking about. I mean, they had studied philosophy, those guys. I admire them. But I couldn't get a team of young people. I couldn't convince young people to even listen to me. They said, where is the cost function? Where is the backpropagation of error? Leave me alone. And so I find it extremely precious to have found somebody like you who listened to me in that lecture. I mean, I always prayed, oh, let there be one student in the class who gets it. And here is this hero who got it. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Yeah, like I'm not convinced that that backprop won't work until the end, but I'm definitely like putting substantial probability mass on it, and I think it's definitely possible that we will hit the wall with all the paradigm that we have at the moment, and then really like this wall is very expensive. Like we will pour so many billions of dollars and then hit the wall, and then it will be very, very attractive to go back to some other framework that might scale with lower cost, because then academia might be able to do frontier research again, and like startups, it would unlock like so many new like but because now it's only like Google and OpenAI and Anthropic that can do this research, right? Because it's so expensive. So I wouldn't complain too much if we go back to another framework, and yours seems very interesting to me if we come to that point.
Yeah, you asked earlier how come there were these neural or AI winters. And I think the main, I gave an answer, and one of which was lack of processing power. That has evaporated. The processing power is here now. The investment is here. The expectation that it is worthwhile to invest is here. The whole thing has been pushed up to the geopolitical level.
Yes.
The US and China being in a race. So the motivation is here. The vision of economical application is here. So, but the present technology, that is my conviction, and you just conferred, will hit a wall. And will that mean another 10-year AI winter? I don't believe so. I believe the motivation is strong enough so that, I think the transition will take the form of a small team of young people who built this demonstrator that is built on another principle. I've worked for decades, for many decades, to formulate that framework, built on another framework, and shows that here is another way, and then there will be an explosion of everybody jumping on that ship. There's no doubt about it. And it would be nice if I could still see it. And I'm convinced I will. There are signs that the present technology is hitting a wall. The added value of scaling up by another factor of 10 is very small. Then there are these distressing signs that if you feed large language models with their own output, they deteriorate, they collapse, which is a very bad sign. And then there are these problems like you have to educate them, which is a problem. And then the next thing I think will drive home this problem is autonomous robots. Boston Dynamics shows they know how to structure them, to construct them such that they can do somersaults and parkour running and so on, which is very impressive, I must say. Yeah. But when it comes to handling complex situations, that is still a brick wall these days. The autonomous cars, they work 99.9% of the time, but then there are these occasional situations that are completely new to the system, and they sort of stop or create an accident. Transfer that to a household or a factory shop, where the situations are much more complicated. It's hopeless with the present technology. So I'm convinced we have 2 more years or so, and then the brick wall will be all too visible.
That's a great way to end this. Let's see if your predictions hold true, and maybe the new paradigm will be the stuff that we talked about today. Thank you so much for talking with me today.
A pleasure. Thank you.